Boston, 1871. The city was restless, its cobblestone streets alive with the clatter of carriage wheels, the hiss of gas lamps, and the low hum of voices spilling from taverns and theaters. Progress was everywhere, pressing in with iron and steam, but behind the new railways and granite facades lay something older, heavier, and unspoken. The city carried its history like a shadow, long, black, and stretching into every alleyway. In the drawing rooms of Beacon Hill, where fortunes were toasted under chandeliers, a rumor lived. It began as nothing more than a murmur, a curious note passed in conversation, and yet it clung to every whispered corner of the city's elite. Two sisters, Evangeline and Eleanor Davenport, moved through these rooms as if untouched by time. They were the daughters of an old family, one of those names etched so deeply into the bones of Boston that to speak it was to summon a weight of tradition. The Davenports had money, yes, but not the kind that came from factories or shipping ventures. Their wealth had the air of permanence, as though it had been here before the city itself. The sisters, tall and graceful, seemed to embody that same permanence. For years they appeared at soirees in shimmering gowns, their faces pale and luminous, their hair dark and perfectly kept. And year after year, nothing changed. The same eyes, the same skin, the same youth. At first, people admired them the way one admires a fine piece of porcelain or a rare gem. Perhaps it was good fortune, some blessed inheritance that kept their cheeks full and their beauty untouched. But then the years went on, and the admiration turned brittle. The sisters never bent to age, never cracked under time's hand. Friends who had first met them as girls grew old, took on lines, silvered with years, while the Davenports glided on as though the clock had stopped. That was when the glances began, furtive, uncertain, exchanged in silence across candlelit tables. No one ever dared to speak aloud what everyone knew. They simply smiled and nodded, making polite excuses. Perhaps it was their diet. Perhaps they had access to some European tonic no one else could afford. Perhaps they were simply blessed by God. But beneath the surface, in those fleeting moments when the music of a ballroom faded and conversation broke into quiet, there was a different thought. Something was wrong. Something wasn't human. The sisters themselves gave little away. They spoke with the ease of well-bred women, conversed about art and politics, laughed in soft voices. Yet behind the charm lingered a strange detachment. Their eyes, though warm, seemed always to be watching, recording, waiting. They were never hurried, never out of place, always standing at the edge of a crowd as though they had seen it all before. They danced, but their steps carried an unsettling grace, too precise, as if rehearsed beyond human capacity. Their home became a subject of fascination. The Davenport house stood on Beacon Hill, tall and dark, its brick face softened by ivy and years. Curtains were always drawn, windows shut tight against the world. Neighbors spoke of how rarely the doors opened, how even in summer the rooms seemed to breathe cold air. Guests admitted feeling uneasy inside. The silence pressed on the ears until it seemed alive, a silence so thick one lowered their voice without realizing it. It was a house of stillness, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself. Boston was a city of intellect, a city that prided itself on reason, yet here was a mystery that reason could not explain. To speak of it too plainly felt dangerous, almost treasonous against the invisible order that bound society together. So the whispers stayed whispers, circling through parlors and smoking rooms, passed between trembling glasses of champagne. The Davenports were a curiosity, a marvel, a warning. It depended on who told the story. Some said the sisters were a blessing to the city, living proof that Boston was home to the extraordinary. Others muttered about pacts and bargains, about rituals whispered in languages no one should know. A few claimed to have seen them in the same gown years apart, the silk untouched by dust or wear. One woman swore she had attended a gathering 20 years earlier and found the sisters then exactly as they appeared now. Faces smooth, eyes bright, unchanged. She had spoken of it only once, and then never again. Even as progress roared forward, the sisters remained constant, like portraits hung in a gallery. And so the city learned to pretend. to nod politely when they entered a room, to comment on their elegance, to bury unease under practiced smiles. Yet beneath that surface calm was a shared, silent agreement. The Davenports were not like the rest of them. They were something else. And so Boston carried on, gilded and restless, its elite gathering under gaslight, its streets alive with the pulse of industry. But in the quiet corners, in the shadows of Beacon Hill, two young women stood outside the flow of time. Their beauty was not a blessing but a riddle no one dared to solve. And in that silence, in that willful forgetting, the first threads of a darker story began to weave themselves into the city's fabric. The truth was not yet spoken, but it was waiting, humming beneath the floorboards, heavy in the stillness of the Davenport home. A truth that was not about wealth or beauty, but about something far older, something no city built by human hands was meant to hold. Boston, for all its light and promise, was already carrying a shadow too dark to name. The Davenport name was older than Boston itself. It clung to the city's earliest records, etched into shipping logs and land grants, whispered through faded letters carried across the Atlantic. While other families came chasing opportunity, the Davenports had arrived with purpose. They did not wander, they did not search. They carried with them something more than wealth, something that hummed beneath their blood. Theirs was a lineage that seemed bound to an inheritance no one could quite define. When merchants spoke of fortunes, they named timber, fur, molasses. When neighbors whispered of the Davenports, they spoke of a book. The book was not kept in plain sight. It was wrapped in dark leather, its pages stitched and strange, and passed from father to eldest son with a warning never to read. It was an heirloom not of knowledge but of silence. The script within appeared to move if one stared too long, curling and shifting like letters that resisted understanding. To hold it was to feel warmth, as if the very object carried a pulse. For generations, it sat untouched, locked behind oak doors in the family library, guarded with a reverence that carried equal parts devotion and fear. But when the sister's father took possession, silence became unbearable. He was not a man of faith, but of dread. Illness had seized his body with a slow, merciless grip. His skin grew waxy, his strength fell away, and a restless terror grew inside him. Death was no longer an idea, but a presence he could feel at his shoulder. His wealth, his standing, his name, none of it could protect him from the emptiness that loomed ahead. And so, night after night, as fever gnawed his bones, his eyes drifted toward the locked cabinet that held his family's oldest secret. He told himself he would resist, that he was strong enough to die with dignity. But fear is stronger than resolve, and fear of death strongest of all. At last he gave in. The cabinet was opened, the key turning with a metallic sigh, and the forbidden book was drawn into the light. He traced its surface with trembling fingers, marveling at the shifting script that seemed to breathe beneath his gaze. The pages smelled of earth and iron, as if dug from a grave. He read, and in reading he was consumed. The ritual described within promised continuity, not for a man, but for his blood. It spoke of binding time, of tethering life so it would not slip away. It whispered that the name Davenport would never vanish, that its line would not rot in the soil, but remain forever. He saw in those words salvation, not damnation. He imagined his daughters preserved, their beauty untouched, their future secured against the decay that claimed every other family. He told himself he was noble, that his sacrifice would be for them. But the truth, though he could not admit it, was far simpler. He was afraid to be forgotten. The ritual was not performed with grand ceremony. There were no witnesses, no audience. It was a private bargain carried out in the library's silence. Candles were lit, strange symbols traced, and words spoken in a voice he did not recognize as his own. The house seemed to lean in, the walls shuddering as though listening. Something unseen answered, and something ancient stirred. When the final word left his mouth, a silence heavier than death fell over the room. His body collapsed, his fevered mind unraveling, but his daughters stood frozen in the doorway, caught in the grip of a power they could neither understand nor resist. At first, nothing seemed to change. The sisters wept for their father, buried him with the solemnity expected of their station, and carried on. But the days passed, and time slipped strangely around them. They did not tire. They did not alter. Their reflections stared back with the same flawless faces they had worn at 23. What seemed a blessing soon revealed itself as a trap. For every month that passed, their bodies remained untouched, while their minds carried the slow weight of years. They remembered everything but changed in nothing. Those who visited the house after the funeral remarked upon a stillness that seemed deeper than grief. Evangeline moved through the halls as if drifting, her steps soundless. Ella Laner lingered by mirrors, staring at her own unchanging face until her eyes burned with exhaustion she never showed. The servants whispered, unsettled by the way the sisters hardly ate, how their skin felt cold beneath a touch, how their presence filled the air with an unspoken tension. It was not mourning, they said. It was something else. The truth was that the ritual had not preserved life. It had consumed it, drawn it into a loop that kept the sisters suspended but never free. Their father's wish for continuity had been granted, but in a form more cruel than death. The book had not given them eternity. It had stolen the rhythm of living and replaced it with stillness. Boston's families noticed. At dinners and galas, they smiled politely but watched with wary eyes. They wondered what had been done, what bargain had been struck. Some whispered that the Davenports had traded their souls for youth. Others suspected stranger forces at work, something older than scripture, older than the city. But no one spoke openly. To question too deeply was to risk being dragged into the same shadow. And so the sisters remained, unaging, unchanged, untouched by the seasons. Their father's ambition had saved the family name, but at a terrible cost. The forbidden legacy of the Davenports was no longer locked away in a cabinet. It walked through Boston's streets in the form of two women who looked as though time itself bowed before them. But what appeared to be a miracle was in truth a curse, and the city, though it pretended otherwise, knew it. The change was not sudden. It crept into the Davenport house like dampness seeping through old stone, slow and relentless, until everything was touched by it. At first, the sisters seemed only quiet, withdrawn in a way that could be excused as grief. Evangeline walked the halls with a faraway gaze, as though the world outside no longer concerned her. Ella Laner lingered in front of mirrors, staring for hours at the face that never altered, her fingers tracing her skin as if searching for proof that she was still real. Servants whispered that they heard her speaking in a low, strange voice when no one else was in the room, a sound guttural and hollow, carrying no resemblance to English. The doctors called it melancholy, the polite word for despair, but Dr. Alistair Thorne knew better. He had been their father's friend, a man who had shared books and secrets with him, who had once helped him gather old volumes from forgotten corners of Europe. When he was summoned to the house after the funeral, he recognized the signs that others chose to ignore. The sisters did not simply mourn. Their bodies betrayed something stranger. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with faint blue veins showing beneath. Their hands were cold, even in firelight. And when he pressed his stethoscope against their ribs, he heard not the steady rhythm of hearts, but a slow, unnatural beat that seemed to echo like a drum buried underground. Thorne was a man of science, but he was also a man with secrets of his own. His medical practice thrived on discretion. He treated ailments no one else dared speak of, the quiet shames of Boston's wealthiest families. That was why the Davenports trusted him. Yet what he saw in the sisters unsettled even him. He began a private journal, kept locked in his desk, where he described every detail with a precision that bordered on obsession. He wrote of the way Evangeline's eyes sometimes clouded over, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. He recorded how Ella Laner's voice, once light, now carried a resonance that made the air itself tremble. He noted how neither seemed to eat more than a bite, and yet their strength never faltered. The more he wrote, the more the unease took root in him. He had read passages from that forbidden book before, back when their father had begged for help deciphering it. He had dismissed it then as nonsense, a relic of superstition. But now he saw in the sisters the echo of those words made flesh. The book had promised continuity, but what it delivered was stillness, a kind of half-life. The sisters were not alive in the way others were, but neither were they dead. They were caught between, suspended in a state no science could explain. Outside the house, the city moved on. The bells of churches rang, carriages clattered through the squares, and society continued to smile and toast. But inside, time had become something twisted. The clocks ticked, the days changed, yet the sisters remained the same. That sameness wore on them. Evangeline sometimes wept without sound, tears slipping down her perfect face as if she were mourning the years she would never wear. Ella Laner grew restless, pacing corridors deep into the night, her lips moving with words no one could recognize. Once, a maid swore she saw her shadow move against the wall while Ella Laner herself stood still, the two shapes refusing to match. Dr. Thorne tried to reason with himself. Perhaps it was illness, some rare condition. Perhaps the mind, tormented by grief, could twist the body in ways not yet understood. But in his heart, he knew. He had seen their father's obsession, the fevered look in his eyes as he studied that shifting script. He had felt the weight of the pages, the strange warmth they carried. And now he saw the consequences written across the faces of two women who should have aged, who should have grown into wives and mothers, but who instead lingered like portraits hung in a gallery of the damned. What unsettled him most was not their beauty or their stillness, but the moments of lucidity. There were times when the sisters would look at him with sudden clarity, their eyes sharp, their voices breaking through the haze. In those moments, they begged him to help them. Evangeline once clutched his sleeve with desperate strength and whispered, "Make me old." Ella Laner, trembling, begged him to let her die. Then the clarity would fade, and they would drift back into their strange silence, their eyes vacant once more. Thorne's practice began to suffer. Patients withdrew without explanation. Invitations ceased arriving. He noticed men on the street looking at him with quiet recognition, then turning away as though to mark him with silence. He realized the city itself was pressing him into isolation. The truth he was discovering was not only terrible, but also forbidden. The families who smiled at the Davenports at dinners, who clapped politely at their presence, knew something. They chose not to see, because seeing was dangerous. They had learned long ago that silence was safer than truth. The doctor's journal grew thicker with each passing week, filled with accounts of whispered languages, reflections that flickered like flames, voices carried through walls. He knew that he had become entangled in something far greater than illness. He was not only a witness, but a participant, caught in a web spun long before his birth. And still, he returned to the house, driven by both fear and pity. He could not turn away from the sisters, no matter how deep their descent became. In the stillness of the Davenport home, Dr. Thorne began to understand that he was watching not a sickness, but a transformation. The sisters were unraveling, their humanity slipping away thread by thread, replaced by something that was neither mortal nor divine. And though he wrote with the precision of a man of science, his heart knew he was chronicling the slow, silent birth of monsters. By autumn of 1871, the Davenport home had grown into something more than a residence. It had become a presence in its own right, looming over Beacon Hill like a sentinel of secrets. Its windows stayed shuttered, its heavy curtains drawn even at noon, so that it seemed blind to the outside world. But those who passed along the cobbled street swore they felt its gaze. The house did not watch with eyes, but with stillness. Its silence seeped outward, an invisible weight that pressed on the air and sent shivers through anyone who lingered too long at its gate. Dr. Thorne had visited many times, always stepping into the suffocating hush with the steady composure of a physician. Yet each time he left, he felt weaker, as though the house had drained him of some essential part of himself. It was not grief alone that made the air heavy. It was something older, something alive. He began to sense that the house was no longer merely stone and timber, but an archive, a vessel that had swallowed the forbidden knowledge and grown fat upon it. The library especially seemed to breathe. He felt it the moment he entered, a soft hum beneath the floorboards, a pressure against his temples. The books lined neatly on the shelves no longer seemed like books at all. Their spines bulged as if fused into the walls, their pages sealed shut as though they had chosen silence. He tried to convince himself it was imagination, the fevered invention of a tired mind. But the signs gathered, and soon he could not deny them. Shadows clung too long to corners, mirrors rippled without being touched, doors closed without sound. At night, he would dream of corridors that stretched far beyond the dimensions of the house, filled with whispers that shifted like smoke. And always the sisters were there, waiting at the end, their faces pale, their eyes empty, their youth frozen as if mocking the very idea of time. The decision to act came quietly, like an illness settling into his blood. He realized that no one else would intervene. The families of Boston had closed their eyes. The servants had fled one by one, leaving the house hollow. Even the church, when he sought guidance, offered only platitudes, as if the clergy too had been warned into silence. He was alone, but he could not abandon them. He told himself he was still a doctor, still bound to heal. Yet beneath that oath was another truth he could not admit aloud. He was drawn to the darkness, pulled toward it by the same curiosity that had doomed their father. On the night of October 23rd, mist rolled over the city, thick and low, muffling the clatter of wheels and the laughter of taverns. Thorne dressed not as a physician but as an intruder, carrying with him tools of both craft and desperation. An oil lamp, a scalpel, salts, and powders gathered from the margins of old texts, fragments of remedies half-remembered from ancient manuscripts. He had mapped the house in his mind, memorized the servant passages, the narrow stairwells, the forgotten doors that no guest had seen in decades. If he was to strike at the heart of the curse, he would need to move unseen. He slipped through a side entrance long and used, the wood swollen with damp, the hinges sighing as they gave way. Inside, the air was colder than the night outside, dense and metallic, tasting faintly of rust. The silence was immediate, crushing, as though the house itself disapproved of his intrusion. He pressed forward, his lamp casting a pale circle that trembled against wallpaper faded with age. Portraits of long-dead Davenports lined the walls, their painted eyes following him with suspicion. He thought he saw one mouth curl faintly into a smile, though he dared not look twice. He moved with practiced caution, each step measured, his breathing controlled. The hum beneath the floor seemed louder now, like the slow, deliberate breath of some vast, unseen creature. He knew where he was going. The library. The heart of it. The place where the forbidden text had once been read aloud, where the air still carried the echo of words not meant for human tongues. Every corridor brought him closer to that pulse, the vibration thrumming through the timber and stone. He felt it in his bones, as though the rhythm of his own blood was being matched to the cadence of the house. At last he reached the heavy door. It was not locked. The handle turned easily under his hand, as though the house expected him, as though it had been waiting. He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. The room was darker than the rest, the air thick and sweet, carrying the faint scent of burnt wax and something metallic, almost like blood long dried. He raised his lamp, and the flame revealed the impossible. The books were no longer separate objects but part of the walls, their spines fused into the wood, their titles shifting like restless dreams. Some seemed to pulse faintly, as if still alive. And there, at the center of the room, sat the sisters. Evangeline in one chair, Eleanor in the other, their pale faces dimly lit, their hands folded in their laps. Their eyes were open but vacant, fixed on nothing. They looked less like women than like statues carved from ivory, perfect and lifeless. For a moment, Thorne dared to believe they were asleep, that perhaps he had arrived too late. But then a flicker passed across Evangeline's face, the barest twitch of awareness, and he knew they were not asleep at all. They were waiting. A cold dread pressed down upon him as the silence deepened. He realized that he was not alone with the sisters. Something else filled the room, invisible yet immense, a presence that weighed upon his chest and made the air hard to breathe. He understood then what he had long suspected but never admitted. The curse was not confined to ink and parchment. It had grown beyond the book. The house itself had become the archive, a living container of forbidden knowledge, and he was inside its mind. The lamp quivered in his hand, casting erratic shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. He knew he should turn back, flee before the door sealed behind him forever. But something stronger than fear held him in place. He had come this far, and the silence of Boston would not save the sisters. If salvation existed, it lay here in this room, at the very heart of the darkness. And so he stepped further in, the hum rising in his ears until it sounded like a chorus of whispers, 1,000 voices speaking as one, waiting for him to answer. The air in the library seemed to close around him, thick and pulsing, alive with a rhythm that did not belong to his own body. Dr. Thorne stood with the lamp trembling in his hand, its light casting frail golden circles on walls that no longer resembled shelves, but a living skin of fused volumes, their spines twitching as though they had veins beneath the leather. The sisters sat unmoving in their chairs, their pale faces bathed in the dim glow, their eyes open but empty, as though they had been hollowed out long before he entered. For a moment, he felt as if he were intruding not upon a room, but upon the interior of some vast creature, its silence not absence, but breath held in waiting. He had come prepared to end it. The oil lamp was not just for light, but for fire. He had carried salts and herbs stolen from obscure texts, powders meant to sever unholy ties. His plan was simple in design, desperate in execution. He would set the library alight, destroy the parasite where it had rooted, and free the sisters from their prison. Yet as he raised the lamp higher, he felt the certainty of failure pressing against his chest. He was too late. The house had been expecting him. A sound, soft as a sigh, rippled through the room. Evangeline's gaze shifted, not fully awake, but aware enough to meet his eyes. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Ella Laner followed, her head tilting in a gesture too slow, too precise, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. Their stillness ended, but what replaced it was worse, a sudden weight in his mind, a thought not his own. It came without words, a whisper pressed against the inside of his skull, ancient and intimate. "You think you can destroy us?" His fingers tightened around the lamp. He tried to shut it out, but the whisper grew louder, curling through his thoughts with the familiarity of his own voice. "We are not in the house. We are in the blood." He stumbled back, the flame flickering dangerously as his breath quickened. The realization struck him with cold clarity. The house was a shell, the library a vessel, but the true hosts were seated before him. The curse lived within them, had taken root in their very essence. He had not come to save them. He had come to feed them. The sisters rose in unison, their movements smooth and inhuman, their eyes no longer vacant but bright with a predatory hunger. Evangeline's lips curved into something too thin to be called a smile. Ella Laner's voice broke the silence, but it was not a voice. It was a resonance, a vibration that filled the air like a bell struck deep underground. "Host," she said, and the word was not sound but sensation, crawling through his flesh. Thorne staggered, clutching at his chest as if to claw the word out of him. He understood then that the ritual had not been a single act bound to their father. It was a cycle, a hunger passed from one vessel to the next, a chain of hosts stretching back further than he could imagine. The sisters, trapped in their stillness, had grown weary of bearing it alone. They were not only predators, but prisoners. And now they had chosen him. Panic rose, but alongside it came something far more dangerous: temptation. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, a pull toward the promise woven into the whisper. Immortality, freedom from the slow decay of flesh, the power to step outside the common fate of men. It beckoned, sweet and terrible. He saw visions, his practice restored, his name exalted, influence beyond what he had ever known. He saw himself untouchable, eternal. And for a moment, he wavered. But the memory of their vacant eyes, of their whispered pleas to let them die, broke through the haze. He raised the lamp high, his hand shaking but resolute. "Fire," he thought. "Only fire can end this." With a cry that was half prayer, half defiance, he hurled the lamp toward the wall of fused books. The glass shattered, and flames leapt hungrily, devouring parchment and wood. Heat rushed through the chamber, smoke curling upward in frantic spirals. The house groaned as if alive, a low shudder running through its beams. The sisters screamed, but it was no human sound. Their voices blended with the hum of the house, a chorus of rage and despair that rattled the very walls. Thorn covered his ears, stumbling toward the door, the fire spreading behind him. Yet even as the flames rose, he felt the whisper clawing at his mind, stronger than ever, refusing to be silenced. "You cannot burn us. We are already inside you." He fell to his knees, gasping, as Evangeline and Elainer stepped through the fire unharmed, their eyes locked on him. Their bodies did not blister, their gowns did not char. They moved closer, their presence pressing against him until he felt his very soul bending. In that instant, he knew the truth. The fire was meaningless. The parasite had already chosen. He had been marked from the moment he first read the shifting words, from the instant he began to write in his secret journal. He was not destroying the curse. He was becoming it. A final rush of heat engulfed the room, and Thorn's screams split the night, though whether it was defiance or surrender he could not tell. Witnesses on the street would later recall the blaze consuming the house, flames clawing high into the mist, windows bursting with sparks. Yet amid the chaos, they swore they saw a figure stumble from the inferno. It moved with unnatural grace, its face twisted in a silent cry, its body both man and shadow. They did not know his name, but they knew what they saw was not fully human. The Davenport sisters were never found. The fire reduced the house to charred stone and ash. Officials blamed a faulty gas line, declared it a tragic accident, and ordered silence to follow. But in the whispers that circled afterward, in the fearful glances exchanged by Boston's oldest families, the truth lingered. Dr. Alastair Thorne had not perished in the flames. He had been remade. The parasite had found its new host, and the sisters, in their final act, had freed themselves by passing their burden on to him. He had entered the house as a doctor, armed with reason and resolve. He had emerged as something else, something bound to the hunger he had sought to destroy. The fire had not ended the curse. It had crowned its next keeper. The ruins of the Davenport house smoldered for days, the blackened stones steaming in the misty mornings, the air thick with the smell of ash and charred wood. The city spoke of it briefly, clucking tongues about faulty pipes and tragic accidents, then moved on with startling ease. Boston had no appetite for horrors that lingered too close to home. The newspapers printed polite reports, neat columns of speculation, and then silence. The sisters' names were not spoken again in public. Their portraits disappeared from parlors, their presence from society records. Within weeks, it was as though Evangeline and Elainer had never lived at all. But the silence was not innocent. It was cultivated, tended like a garden by hands that preferred shadows to truth. The city's elite knew what had happened that night was not a simple fire. They knew the sisters' absence was not explained by death. Yet they chose to erase, not remember. To forget was safer. To pretend was survival. They had built their power on silence, and silence would bury this too. Dr. Alastair Thorne did not vanish with the blaze. Those who glimpsed him stumbling from the fire could never forget the sight. A figure half man, half shadow, his face twisted in a scream no lips could voice. Some swore they saw him walk the streets weeks later, his body restored, his practice suddenly thriving, his influence deeper than ever. His eyes, they said, glowed with something not entirely human. Patience returned to him. Invitations flowed once more, and he rose quietly into the circles that had once shunned him. He was no longer the man who had tried to fight the parasite. He was now its vessel, its herald, its host. The journal he had kept, filled with meticulous records of the sisters' decline, did not burn in the fire. Rumor placed it deep within an archive, misfiled as a work of fiction, bound in leather and sealed with wax. The final page carried only one word, scrawled with a desperate hand: we. Not I, not me, but we. It was his last moment of clarity, the recognition that he was no longer alone in his own mind. He had become a fragment of a larger will, a single voice in a hive of silence. The shadow elite of Boston thrived on such bargains. They did not deal in coins or contracts, but in secrets. Power was not built on wealth alone, but on what could be hidden, on what others dared not speak. The story of the Davenport sisters became their masterpiece of erasure. A family undone by forbidden knowledge, daughters trapped in ageless bodies, a doctor consumed by the very cure he sought. None of it was history. It was rewritten as rumor, downgraded to curiosity, buried until it was dust. This was their true power, to decide not only what lived, but what was remembered. Yet the silence itself carried a shadow. For even if the city forgot, the parasite did not. It had no interest in fire or stone. It lived in blood, in thought, in hunger. Dr. Thorne became its emissary, a man of science reshaped into a creature of secrecy. He smiled at dinners, shook hands in parlors, treated patients with skill and charm. But behind his eyes lingered the ancient whisper, guiding him, bending his will. And slowly, carefully, he began to find others, men and women hungry for more, desperate for power, trembling before death. He did not need to offer them coin. He needed only to let them taste the promise that had trapped him, immortality at the cost of self. Boston's oldest families were not horrified. They were intrigued. They saw in Thorne not a curse but a key. They did not flinch at the sisters' fate, nor recoil from the parasite's hunger. They understood that control was not about brute force, but about subtle fear, about secrets that bent men into silence. To join the network was to step beyond mortality, to be chosen. And so the parasites spread not in shadows alone, but in smiles, in polite handshakes, in whispered invitations after midnight. The Davenport sisters became the first sacrifice, the original sin, the story whispered only to those already inside. Their faces, once luminous with youth, lived on as warnings of the cost. But warnings, like secrets, have power. They drew the curious, the desperate, the ambitious. The city did not bury the story by accident. It buried it as bait. To seek it out was to fall into its trap. To follow its threads was to walk willingly toward the parasite, to offer oneself as host. Generations passed, but the silence endured. Families rose, fortunes grew, buildings replaced the old ruins. Yet in certain rooms behind closed doors, in archives where mislabeled volumes gathered dust, in the restless dreams of those who wanted more than life could give, the darkness waited. It had no need to rush. It was patient. It had eternity. The lie became stronger than the truth. The lie said the sisters never existed. The lie said the fire was an accident. The lie said Dr. Thorne was a physician of great standing who lived a long and respectable life. The lie was easier to believe, easier to tell, easier to pass down. And with every telling, the lie became the truth itself, until no one could say where history ended and conspiracy began. Yet sometimes, in the quiet of the city's oldest neighborhoods, a window will open though no hand touches it, or a figure will pass too quickly in the mist. Sometimes, in the stacks of an old university library, a student will find a volume bound in leather that seems too warm to the touch. And sometimes, in the stillness of a crowded room, someone will feel eyes on them, cold and patient, waiting to see if they will ask the wrong question. The Davenport sisters were erased, but their legacy was not silence. It was hunger. It was a pattern written into the very bones of the city, repeating itself again and again, unseen but undeniable. They were not simply victims of their father's folly. They were the beginning of something larger, something that slipped from rumor into reality. And the truth, if such a thing can be said to exist, is this: the darkness does not die. It only changes its host.